Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 340. It's Monday of week 8. We're going to be talking about the Northeast this week. Last week, you had your test. Hopefully, that went well for everyone. Seemed pretty straightforward. You would have seen those questions before on the quizzes, and hopefully, having more than one chance helps you with that as well. I posted the review, and so hopefully, you watched that. Not as many people watched it as I would have hoped, since I can see the stats, but I can't see who watched it. But I would encourage you for the final to check that out. I also did a day where I went over your projects in this class and what you're going to be doing for your paper and presentation. Hopefully you watched all of that because you got your papers coming up pretty quick. 18 days from today, your papers are due. So if you have any questions about that, anybody have any questions? You look at the outline, follow the outline. That's how I'm going to be grading them. If you don't have a part in the outline, and it's still the right number of pages, you will lose points because I'm grading based on making sure you have all the content that we're looking for, not just an arbitrary page number. Okay, so that's coming up soon, and your PowerPoint is going to be following closely on the heels of that as well. We also have everybody's favorite spring break coming up next week, so that'll be a great chance for you to get caught up with anything you might be falling behind because I have to post midterm grades, I think by Sunday. I think it's this week actually on Sunday. But they're coming up really soon, so if you are behind and you want something counted for your midterm grade, I will be posting those this weekend, I guess. Um, yeah. Any questions about that? Cool. And then we will be very quickly moving towards the end of the semester. Once you get through the second, midterms and spring semester, I feel like it all goes pretty quickly, and pretty soon we're going to be in summer. So don't let time slip away from you, and make sure you keep going with your assignments and finish strong. Okay, let's take a look at this week. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so we're talking this week about the Northeast. At this point, hopefully you have a pretty good idea why that's switching. Let me try that again. No. 1 second. I'll set those in first. There we go. At least for those of you online, that should be better. We're talking about the Northeast this week. Oh, I know how to do this. You can't see that. Sorry. All right, so here we are. We are in the north. We're in the Northeast, and we've been talking about different areas around North America throughout the last 3 or 4 weeks at this point. So you have a pretty good idea of how we're going to do this. We're going to kind of go in the way back history today, then we'll kind of get to the colonial era on Wednesday. So we've done a number of different areas so far. We've done the Southwest, we've done the Pacific Coast, we've also talked about the Southeast, and now we're moving up to the Northeast. And in many ways, the Northeast has a lot of cultural similarities to the Southeast. We're going to see, especially during kind of the early part's going to be a little bit different because of the climate, especially kind of at the tail end of the Ice Age. Climate conditions were a lot colder and harsher up here in the Northeast than they would have been in the Southeast. But once we get towards kind of the later eras of prehistory, we're going to see a lot of continuity. And in fact, not that who am I to question Sutton's wisdom? And in many ways, I would break up the Northeast into a little bit differently than Sutton does. He has this kind of larger area of the Northeast. And I think how I would do it would be maybe a little bit different, especially kind of in the prehistoric times, because we see a lot of continuity with these kind of mound sites here in the kind of Ohio River Valley, very similar to what we're going to see in the Southeast. And if you know anything about geography, that's because the Ohio River flows into the Mississippi and they were trading and sharing culture between it. And also, I would probably bring the border of the Northeast south a little bit. Sutton includes kind of this northern area up here, northern Maine, and sometimes into Canada up here, New Brunswick. And I would actually kind of limit move some of these up to the subarctic, especially those kind of hunter and gatherer patrilineal caribou hunting bands that we find up at the northeast corner there. But again, who am I to question Sutton's wisdom? But in general, we can think of this northeast pretty broadly. Again, I would probably move the southeast up a little bit there along the coast. But we can kind of think about from the Atlantic coast, from the Carolinas up to New Brunswick, and then including not only what we consider like the Northeast or New England, but as you'll notice, kind of the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley kind of region as well. So that's kind of the area we're going to be talking about. It's a big area. But it's kind of ecologically defined by a lot of water, not quite as much as we think about in like the Pacific Northwest, but abundant rainfall, rivers and lakes, coastal areas, especially, or coastal areas where you can get marine resources up here. And then kind of in the interior, characterized by this kind of vast stretch of woodland forest, which actually kind of gives the name for the later prehistoric period of the woodland era. So we're going to start out by thinking about some of these really old archaeological sites and taking a look at a couple of them. I'm going to show you this quick video. It's 5 minutes or 6 minutes we'll watch of this on some of these really old prehistoric sites, and then I'll walk you through just a couple of them to give you an idea. But basically the main point is that when we talk about this, right, we find really early sites up in the Northeast, even up into New England. And these are, surprisingly early. We're going to take a look at one site in particular called the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. And these showed people coming into the landscape much earlier than you might assume, right? At a time when glaciers are still kind of dominating this northern region. People living almost right at the foot of these glaciers, right, in these kind of tundra conditions, and small dispersed sites, and then people kind of living there and following the game. So I'm going to show you just a number of different sites throughout the region, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them. So if you are following along at home, we're going to start, we're going to watch just a few minutes, probably 5 minutes or 6 minutes or so of this video called The Prehistory of New England Native Americans. So we will watch up to, actually we'll watch about 8 minutes of this. So catch you in a few. All right, we just watched about 8, 9 minutes of the prehistory of New England. So before we move on and take a look at these sites particularly, what did you notice in the video about the way of life in the archaic or in the Paleo-Indian and the archaic Northeast? What do we notice looking at these sites across time? What kind of big trends did you see in the video? Are they the same at the beginning as at the end? No. How are they different?
The landscape changed.
Yeah, the landscape changed, right? In the beginning, it's very glacial, or like you're almost right next to the glaciers in the tundra, and then by the end, it's more what? It's more temperate, it's more forested, you have rivers. And so how does that ecological change, kind of being a following Sutton, where ecology is really important, how would that ecological change, how does that manifest in the archaeological record? What do we see people doing a little bit differently in the end compared to the beginning of? More permanent settlements, yeah, and we'll see that. As people have to move around less in the beginning, they're chasing game around. We find more permanent settlements and the kind of establishment of villages. What about technology? So we see different technologies. Yeah, in the beginning, they're optimized for hunting megafauna, and then by the end, we see a whole bunch of different technologies, especially focused on both marine resources, as well as fish weirs and fish traps, as well as hunting things like deer, and especially once the bow and arrow is invented later during the woodland period, that changes as well. So let's take a look at this. Okay, so let me share for you online. So, like you saw in the video, we can start way back at the Paleo-Indian period. Um, During this time, much of what we think of as the Northeast, especially New England and the kind of Great Lakes area, is covered by glaciers. And that's actually where we get the Great Lakes from, right? And if you've ever been up in that region, this is from the retreating ice sheets, kind of scouring the landscape and creating these big areas, these indentations as the ice kind of rolls back, creating these lakes. And there's actually a really big difference between kind of the northern end of the Northeast, especially kind of in the Great Lakes region, and kind of towards the south. Our modern states don't exactly line up. And when I lived in Illinois, you could actually see it. The north half or two-thirds of the state is pretty flat and scoured by these glaciers, while the bottom third is more rolling hills, almost Appalachia-like, because the glaciers never got down that far. During this time, we see populations beginning to emerge along what is now the Great Lakes. Um, and one of these earliest sites is called the Vale site, about 10,600 years ago, and show evidence of Clovis points along just south of where the glaciers would have been that time. And it seems people are hunting caribou with these Clovis points. Like you saw in the video, one of the oldest sites in the region is the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. It's in Pennsylvania, and it's one of the areas. It's the area, probably, at least to my knowledge, in the Northeast, where we have the oldest occupation and possibly one of the oldest occupations in North America. Meadowcroft is kind of a classic site in what's known as the pre-Clovis debate. Meadowcroft was discovered, I believe, in the 1970s. And it was one of these really early sites that may push the kind of, it was one of these early sites that people argued may push the dates of human occupation in North America beyond what we see here in Clovis. And there's some question about the validity of those dates, and exactly how old it is. Some people say it's more like 19,000 years. Some people say it's more like 12 to 14, which would kind of more line up with what Clovis is. But regardless, it's really, really old. And especially at a place that, again, would have been at a very cold, inhospitable environment. So we see people living there really early on. Today, the kind of pre-Clovis side, I think is pretty well won. We found lots of sites that may be pre-Clovis or predate what we have here in eastern New Mexico. But Meadowcroft is famous for being one of the very first. And if you go to Pennsylvania, you can go check it out. And they have this kind of they have the shelter built over like a building built over the rock shelter. And it's similar to like what we have out at Blackwater Draw, where you can go and see the actual excavations that they have there. And it's a remarkable site, mostly because there's this really long continuity of occupation. It wasn't just that people showed up there 14,000 years ago and then left. There seems to be kind of long-term occupation at the site. People kind of living there, not as like a permanent village, but returning to this site over and over the course of more than 10,000 years. So the really early stuff shows that there were people there pretty much as soon as the glacier started rolling back. We can move up a little bit in time to what's known as the Archaic period, about 9,000 years ago to about 2,500 years before present. And again, like we've talked about in the Southeast, this is a period of intensification of groups kind of settling into the landscape. While they're still hunter and gatherers, we do start to see a little bit more people being in a smaller area and starting to use those resources more intensely, and maybe even some early forms of, if not domestication, maybe horticultural traditions where people start thinking about the environment differently. And like we talked about with our Southeast groups, one interesting thing that we see up in the Northeast during the Archaic period is the beginning of these mounds. Just like we kind of talked about with, Cahokia and some of these other sites down in the Southeast. Mounds start to emerge about 6,500 years ago. in the area. And what do you think that means when we start to see these kind of structures? What does that tell us about these people? They're building a big mound. They're sedentary, or at least they have some kind of territory, right? Like they may still be moving around the landscape, but a mound is a great way of saying this is where I live, right? Because it takes a lot of work, especially in a society that doesn't have domesticated animals or machinery to build this, right? We would also probably point to some kind of larger social complexity beyond the family band, right? Because this is going to be really hard for me and my kids to build. It's going to take, some larger form of society. Also, at this time, about 5,500 years ago, we start to see the adaptation not just of hunting caribou, but hunting all kinds of things, especially marine animals, sea mammals, fishing, continued caribou hunting, also bird hunting. People basically exploiting all the resources that are available to them in their environment. One way that we can tell these people are, what's a way we can tell that people are becoming increasingly sedentary? Yeah, maybe art, especially things that are a little heavier. What else? Agriculture, we'll get to that in a little bit. Yeah, agriculture. How can we tell that people are doing agriculture though? Tools, the agricultural tools, things for planting and harvesting, and also storage, right? And this is where we see the emergence of early pottery about 4,000 years ago. Pottery tells us that people are living in one place because pottery is heavy, and if you move it around too much, it's going to break. So lets us know that people are probably staying in one place, and they're also starting to depend more on those plant resources than early hunter-gatherers, which had a larger percentage of their diet being meat. We also see trade becoming an important part, especially as people start to settle into the landscape and say, this is our place and we live here. If you're not moving around as much, but you still want cool stuff from elsewhere, you're going to have to trade with people. And material artifacts are a really great way of letting us know what was going on during that time and how people interacted with each other. Because we'll find, for instance, copper from the Great Lakes region coming down to coming over to New England, or we'll see stone from certain places moving across the landscape. So it lets us know that there is different groups and they seem to be interacting with each other. And this is coupled with the emergence of warfare in the region, especially between these different groups. During this time, like I just said, we have this kind of agricultural revolution, but we haven't got to kind of the classic corns, beans, and squash, which we'll see later, which kind of underpins the later woodland periods. During this time, people are farming with the plants that they have, or at least experimenting with agriculture with the plants they have nearby. Corns, beans, and squash are Mesoamerican crops. We'll get to them in a few weeks. But in New England, just like in the Southeast, we see people starting to experiment with different types of indigenous cultigens, some including sunflower, Jerusalem, artichoke, sumpweed, goosefoot, knotwood, maygrass, and little barley. Again, what do you notice about most of these crops? Do we use them today? I like sunflower seeds. But like for the most part, these are, while these are kind of this early attempt at agriculture, they don't seem they're an early attempt, right? We don't tend to use this today. They're kind of not quite as efficient as some of these later corns, beans, and squash would comes in. But we still, like we said, with sunflower still in use today, and then tobacco and gourds are also kind of early cultigens, which are still in use today as well. Move that. And two major things that we see in the this kind of early woodland period that's separated from the archaic period is this kind of elaboration of burial customs. Again, like in the Southeast, we have people going from relatively kind of dispersed burials to centralized burials. And like we talked about with the Windover site, building a cemetery or having burying your people in the same place over a long period of time is a way for you to claim that kind of territory or show that you belong there. And archaeologists often look for cemeteries as kind of an early example of sedentism or living in a single place. We also see kind of an elaboration of these burial practices and different burial practices for different people, right? In the early times, people are all relatively buried the same way. We can think of the Wendover site. Everybody who's buried at the Wendover site, talked about in the southeast, is buried in that bog in relatively the same way. But once we get to kind of this early woodland period, we start to see intensification around certain people's burials, starting out with some of the earliest ones. It seems like, the poor people are cremated after you die, while rich people, they tend to build this kind of wood house around you and let it kind of you and the house start to decay a little bit. Then they burn down the whole house, and then it seems like these mounds are built on top of them. What do you think that tells us is going on in this place? When we go from everybody getting cremated relatively the same to some people increasingly having really fancy burials. Yeah, social hierarchy, complexity, probably the beginning of tribes or chiefdoms, or some kind of difference in status with these kind of people, whether it's achieved or ascribed, but difference in hierarchy. We also see kind of the emergence of a distinct ideology or rituals or beliefs during this time, and people being buried with kind of these with grave goods. And oftentimes we don't, one of the things that you often hear, North America, we don't see any metal working. But we do have this kind of old copper complex, which comes out during the late Archaic, early Woodland period, in which people are trading copper from the north to the northeast from kind of the Great Lakes region, and then cold hammering it and making it into these kind of artistic shapes, which are often buried with important people. Um, During the Woodland period, which is about 2,500 years ago to about 850 years ago, again, this is kind of where people start to go, we see the transition to agriculture more specifically, and the emergence of these kind of larger mound complexes. Probably the earliest of these that we see is the Adenan complex, about 3,000 years ago to about 1,900 years ago. And this is in kind of the upper Ohio River Valley, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio. And these are mound sites. Um, and while there is kind of an overriding pattern here, or there's some similarities between the site, archaeologists think these are probably different groups who have adopted a very similar kind of material pattern. By about 2,200 years ago to about 1,600 years ago, the Hopewell kind of takes over for the Adenan. And this is marked with a transition, not just in kind of more complex burial mounds or larger, amalgamations of people, but this emphasis on new agricultural forms of production. About 1,700 years ago, corn is traded up probably from the southeast, but originally from Mesoamerica. And in many ways, the Northeast is kind of defined by ecology in terms of where you can plant corn, right? If you get too far north, this is kind of my argument earlier. Once you get far enough north in Canada where you have so much, you don't have enough frost-free days to make it through your agricultural cycle, you have to be hunter-gatherer even up until the modern eras. But in the upper Ohio Valley into New England, right, this is really prime area for agriculture. And if you drive across the region today, you'll see it's still filled with corn and beans. So these are much more efficient crops than what we see previously with kind of the sumpweed and the sunflowers and things like that. And it allows people to store more food and have kind of larger amalgamations of people and communities. It also is part of this dramatic increase in trade. And as you can see from this map, trade is just where we, at the Ohio site, and this is in Chillicothe, Ohio. If you're ever driving through, it's like something to do on the road. There's not really that much to do, but it's a great place to stop. And you can kind of see these mounds. In many ways, it looks like you're just kind of walking through a golf course anymore. These nice, like rolling green mounds. But archaeologists working in the region have found that there's a remarkable variety of artifacts kind of buried in these mounds that come from all over North America. You might expect them to be kind of more localized. We got obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, flint from up here in the Dakotas, copper from Minnesota, shark teeth over from the Atlantic, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and shells down here from the Gulf. Um, let's see. Okay. So during this time, there's a lot of population movement, and there's really two ways, right, that we can know about the way that people moved around in the past before ethnographers get there, right? I'm a cultural anthropologist, and we always say just ask people. But like, how do we know about what was going on before, ethnographers got there? One way is like what we're talking about now. We can look at artifacts, right? These are material remains of the past, and they show what people were doing, right? They were trading with each other, or they were going on long distance trading expeditions themselves to move these things around the country. Another way, like we talked about briefly with the Cahokia, is we can do a biological analysis. We can look at where these people were from. We can look at kind of the signatures in their bones from the water or from the food they're eating, which tells us maybe they weren't born there. Another way, if you are a linguistic anthropologist, is to take a look at the languages that people speak. And the languages that people speak are kind of reveal a lot more complexity maybe than the material artifacts do. And again, it's hard because languages today are not necessarily the same as that they were in the past, and there is this kind of added problem of we'll talk about this more next time. In the Northeast, we have a very different kind of trajectory of colonial contact than we have in the Northwest, for instance, right? In the Northwest, we talked about how it was relatively late. It was like 1790 or something before the people of the Northwest had first contact with Europeans. In the Northeast, it's much earlier, right? Probably we all heard in school about like Plymouth Rock and things like that, right? There is very early contact, probably even before that, even before Jamestown, with settlers and whalers kind of setting up here, just decades after Columbus reaches the New World. So by the early 1500s, there is kind of large, there's starting to be European populations here. And even though some of those early populations were relatively small, um, they brought disease, and disease really impacted the populations here. So when we're trying to reconstruct the language, right, a lot of these groups, they don't exist anymore, right? It's very difficult for us to reconstruct, and many of them were gone even during the early colonial era in the United States. But taking that as a grain of salt, we can start to reconstruct some pretty broad patterns in the Northeast. In general, there seems to be kind of two major groups plus a third kind of smaller group. In general, we can talk about this green area here. These are Algonquin speakers. And what can you see about kind of the green on this map? What do you notice? It's real big, right? It goes from all the way down here into kind of the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio, all the way up here through the subarctic, up here to kind of the Canadian Rockies almost. It's this huge area. Um, Recent analysis of kind of language and population movement seems to point to a pretty late dispersal of this movement. About 3,000 years ago, before 3,000 years ago, the Algonquin population seemed to be kind of located up here in kind of the Canadian Shield or on the kind of upper Midwest. But after that time, they seem to move down into these areas, especially kind of these coastal sites. We tend to see kind of a replacement of whoever was there first. It's kind of difficult to tell with these Algonquin speakers. And these are kind of some of the first people that Europeans are going to contact when they get to the Northeast, like the Powhatan, which you see if you've ever seen Pocahontas or something like that, or kind of the tribes up here in Massachusetts, which the Pilgrims are interacting with. The other major group are the Iroquois. This is the blue population. What do you see about that? Broken up as it goes south. Yeah, we talked about them a little bit last time with the Cherokee. The Cherokee are kind of a classic Iroquoian population. We also have other groups like the Tuscaroran down here, the Susquehannock, and then kind of the five or later six classic nations of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, which we'll talk about more on Wednesday. And interestingly, it's almost the opposite story of we see with Algonquins. This seems to be a southern group, kind of down this way, which after, seems like it migrates upward into what's, currently kind of what we think of as classic Iroquois area of the, upstate New York into kind of the eastern Great Lakes region. So this kind of not late, but a population movement, which seems to indicate that maybe some of these earlier groups didn't, there were earlier groups there before, which were replaced either through warfare or disease or some other kind of mechanism, which allowed both the Algonquin and the Iroquoian to inhabit the Northeast. Um, and then finally, we have just a little bit. We're going to talk in a couple weeks about the Great Plains with Siouan languages. There seems to be kind of a little area of Siouan languages here over in Wisconsin and into Minnesota, which again, it just depends on how you kind of slice the Northeast. Okay, so next time we're going to talk a little bit more about the Iroquois people or the Haudenosaunee, and especially focused on kind of the colonial era and their interactions with Europeans, but we don't have time to get into that today. Okay, we're going to stop there for today, and we'll pick up with it on Wednesday. So thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.